There is a hunger that lives in the cold places. Not the hunger of an empty stomach, but something older. Something that walks upright through the tree line when the snow has swallowed every sound. Tonight, let the wind gather at your window. Let the pines lean close. Somewhere far from here, the woods are listening back and the frost has learned to breathe. The zipper pull was on the outside. I lay there in the dark, registering that fact the way you register a sound that does not belong. That slow crawl of comprehension moving up the back of your neck before your mind has even formed the words. I always left it on the inside. Every night for 11 days on this trail, the same ritual. Zip the vestibule, tuck the pull against the inner wall, listen to the nylon settle. It was habit the way breathing is habit. Now it hung on the other side of the fabric. A small dark weight I could see silhouetted against the faint grey of the mesh panel, swaying once, then going still. The cold was wrong too. Not the ordinary cold of a February night bleeding through insulation, but something sharper. Something that felt like the temperature inside the tent had simply dropped to meet whatever temperature was standing just beyond the nylon. My breath came out in a thin, pale cloud. I had not moved. I was not going to move. I counted the seconds without meaning to, the way your mind grabs onto numbers when it has nothing else to hold. 11 minutes, I lay there with my arms flat at my sides and my eyes on the ceiling of the tent, listening for the forest. There was nothing to hear. No wind through the spruce, no owl across the frozen lake, no creak of a branch contracting in the cold. The boreal forest at 4 a.m. carries its own low, constant voice, and that voice was simply gone, as if something had pressed a hand over the mouth of every living thing out there and held it. I pulled the sleeping bag over my face, and I waited for light, already knowing it had not stayed. Dawn came the colour of old bone, the sun a pale smear behind cloud that gave light without warmth. I stood at the tent door with my camera, and I did not step out for a long time. They began at the lake edge, exactly where my tracks began. That was the thing that kept snagging in my mind as I crouched over them and pressed my gloved fingers against the crust to feel what the snow could tell me. Not approaching from the tree line, not crossing from any other direction, simply beginning, mid-stride, the way a sentence begins with a word already underway. Bare toes, 5 of them, splayed wide and pressing deep, the heels sunk a full 2 inches into snow that barely gave under my own weight on snowshoes. I am not a small man. Whatever had walked here was something else entirely. I followed the prints all the way back, stride for stride, step for step. Not beside my tracks, but inside them, overlaid with a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like intention, as though something had studied the length of my gait and matched it exactly. They stopped at the tent door and there they ended, as cleanly as they had begun. I photographed everything and then I got on the radio. The coordinator listened without interrupting while I told him about a large man, possibly a trapper, possibly confused, walking in my path through the night. There was a pause before he reminded me, gently and in the particular tone people use when they want to be careful with you, that the nearest settlement was 40 kilometers northeast. The nearest road was 60 west. I spent the afternoon checking the trail cameras along the ungulate corridor. 2 of the 4 had been knocked face down into the snow. Their housings were intact. The memory cards had been removed from each one and laid in the snow in front of the units, face down neatly, like small deliberate answers to a question I had not yet thought to ask. I replaced both cameras, reset the angles, and packed fresh memory cards in with hands that I made keep steady through the work. On the walk back to camp I did not look at the tree line. That felt important somehow, though I could not have explained it. I strung the paracord at knee height just before dark, looping it around the tent stakes and through the guy line anchors in a rough perimeter, not tight enough to trip anything, just taut enough to snap and wake me. A nervous system for the camp. I cooked inside the vestibule with the outer door zipped to the ground and ate without tasting what I ate, and then I lay down inside my bag with my headlamp around my wrist and my boots still on. At 2:17, the cord went. The snap was small, barely louder than a branch settling in cold, but I was awake before the sound had finished. I turned on the lamp and unzipped the inner door only, just the mesh, and pressed my face close to it. The broken cord lay across the snow on the north side, one end lifting slightly in a breath of wind. Beyond it, at the tree line, there was a shadow that should not have been there. I inventoried the trees in that gap the same way I had catalogued them every morning for 2 weeks, and I knew their shapes the way a man knows the furniture of a room he sleeps in. This was not one of them. It was tall and narrow and leaning slightly forward, as though caught mid-step and then frozen, and it did not move. Not in 40 minutes. Not once. I watched until my headlamp burned down to amber and the shadow simply was not there anymore. I did not hear anything leave. The carcass had moved. I stood at the edge of the spruce thicket and worked through the possibility that I had misread my own GPS coordinates, that I had the wrong stand of trees, that 40 meters and 350 kilograms of dead moose were things a man could simply misremember. I gave that possibility about 4 seconds before I let it go. The drag path was visible once I knew to look for it. A wide, compressed furrow through the snow between the close trunks, bark scraped from the lower spruce at roughly shoulder height on me, branches snapped inward rather than outward as though something very large had pushed through without especially caring what was in the way. The furrow went uphill, at a grade that would have been hard work for a man unladen. The moose lay at the base of the jackpine with its ribcage folded down into itself like a crushed box. I have done necropsy work. I have sat in on predator kills at various stages, and I understand the grammar of how one animal takes apart another. The grammar here was wrong in every particular. The hide was largely intact. There was no scatter, no pieces pulled away and cached, no sign of the frenzied economy that predation leaves behind. The ribs had been pressed inward. The thoracic cavity had been emptied through that compression with a patience, or a method, that I did not have a word for. One set of prints came from downslope, and left going up, the same long bare foot I'd been reading for 3 days, and then the granite ridge took them, and the wind had done the rest. I got the coordinator on the radio. She told me 6 days. I did not argue. I made camp in the open, on flat ground, with the trees as far from me in every direction as the terrain would allow. Night 4, the smell arrived before dark had fully settled, while there was still a thin grey memory of light at the horizon, and I knew it immediately in the way the body knows things before the mind has caught up. Sweet and corrupted and dense, like something that had been eating rot for so long it had become rot, breathing it back out through the pores. I had encountered a version of it in summer fieldwork, standing downwind of old predator kills in the heat, but this was concentrated in a way that summer and distance and open air had never allowed. This was close. This was intimate. It moved. That was what my mind kept returning to, would not let go of. Upwind, then downwind, then neither, as though the source was circling in a way that used the air deliberately, and then the nylon above my face bowed inward, and I understood that something was standing on top of the tent. The fabric pressed down in a shallow depression perhaps a foot from my nose. I watched it shift as the weight redistributed. There was no sound from outside, no creak, no breath, nothing a throat produces. Only the slow rearranging of that depression in the nylon, and the smell so thick now that I could taste it at the back of my mouth. I had a knife. I had a flare. I gripped the flare and I did not fire it because I understood, with a clarity that felt almost calm, that I was afraid of what the light would confirm. The weight lifted. The smell thinned over 10 minutes, moving north by degrees until the air was just cold again. I lay on my back until first light, and then I broke camp and I started walking. I made 22 kilometers before the light failed me. The depression I chose for camp was shallow enough that I could see in every direction without obstruction, the ground flat and pale in the dying light, the nearest tree line a dark seam at the horizon in all directions, 50 meters of open ground on every side. I told myself it was enough. I did not entirely believe it. The moon was full and high by midnight, and the landscape had that cold silver quality that makes distances deceptive, that makes the eye search the middle ground for things that may or may not be there. I was searching. I had been searching since I lay down. It was there, 120 meters north, give or take, standing at the outer edge of what the moonlight could clearly render. Bipedal, still. My first coherent thought was that the proportions were wrong, and then I spent a long moment trying to locate exactly where the wrongness lived. Too much torso, too much upper arm, the head riding slightly forward, as though the neck had a second bend in it that a neck should not have. A subtle forward cant that made the whole silhouette look like something mid-lean, perpetually mid-lean, though nothing was moving. It was thin in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Thin the way a thing is thin when thinness is simply what it is. It did not move while I watched it. I fired the flare. The red light opened across the ground between us, and for 2 seconds I saw it with complete and terrible clarity. Its face was turned up toward the burning arc overhead, and what I saw there I have not been able to give anyone in full. Only this: it was not surprised. It wore the expression of something that had been patient for a very long time, and had simply, quietly, decided that tonight it was finished waiting. The elder's name was Bernard, and he had the kind of stillness that belongs to men who have learned to listen to land the way other men listen to weather. He sat across from me at the table and let me finish, and when I was done he folded his hands and looked at them for a moment before he spoke. He asked about the prints. I had not mentioned the prints. I had not mentioned them because I had not yet decided what to do with the fact of them, whether to believe what I had seen in the grey early light when I finally stopped running and turned around and looked back along the crust of the snow behind me. 2 sets of tracks, mine and something else's, walking not beside mine but in mine, each impression placed with deliberate care inside each hole I had punched, except that where my weight had barely held the surface, the second set had broken through entirely, sinking several inches deeper into the same print, as though whatever made them was heavier than anything that should have fit inside that shape. I told him what I'd seen. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he hears a number that confirms a calculation he already made. Then he was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had no drama in it at all, which was the most frightening thing about it. He told me that there are animals in this world that hunt by learning to be familiar, that they walk your path exactly, step for step, to understand your weight and your rhythm, not to track you, to learn how you move so they will know how you're going to move next. He said the one that followed me home had been practicing for 4 nights now. He said it was probably ready. Frost bit through my gloves at the halfway rung, and I told myself again not to look up. It was July. The pines below the fire tower were still holding the day's heat like coals, and yet the iron under my palms burned with that dry, sucking cold that pulls skin. My boots slipped. I caught the rail with my elbow, felt something crackle across the metal and kept going. 1 rung, another. "Danny, come back up. You forgot the radio." Her voice slid down the ladder after me, soft, patient, the way she talked in the mornings before she was fully awake. Almost right. That was the trouble. Almost. There was a small dragging pause between her words, as if someone were listening for the shape of them before letting them out. 8 minutes. 8 minutes ago I had stood over our cot and watched Alina sleep, and her chest had risen once in the time it took me to count to 40. I had counted twice to be sure. Nobody breathes like that and then walks to the catwalk in stocking feet to call a name down a ladder. "Danny, please, it's cold." The rung under my hand wept a thin skin of ice. I kept my chin tucked to my collar and my eyes on the black tar paper of the roof of the supply shed growing slowly, mercifully closer. Whatever was wearing her mouth up there had not yet learned to beg. I did not want to be on the ladder when it did. 3 weeks earlier the helicopter set us down on a gravel scar the size of a parking space, and the pilot never once eased off the collective. He leaned across Alina to shout at me over the rotor wash, his mouth close enough that I could smell coffee and something medicinal on his breath. "Anything with hooves comes near the stairs," he said. "You burn it. Not shoot. Burn." He would not meet my eyes when he said it. Alina asked him what he meant, and he was already pulling pitch, the skids lifting, our pack still tumbling out the open door onto the stones. We watched the shape of him shrink over the black spruce until the sound of the engine was smaller than the wind. The bog stretched south for miles, stunted trees rising out of standing water like burned matchsticks. The crew name for it was written on the logbook inside the cabin in 3 different hands: The Long Hunger. Alina traced the letters with her thumb and did not say anything. The sun that night refused to finish. It sank to the tree line and stayed there, bleeding a light the colour of old bone across the catwalk, across her face, across the tin roof. We walked the platform to warm ourselves, and somewhere out in the muskeg something walked with us. 2 legs, unhurried. When we stopped, it stopped. When we started again, so did it, matching us stride for stride. The first week wore the costume of ordinary work. We radioed in our grid every 4 hours, swept the horizon for smoke through the old brass scope, and at dusk Alina dealt gin rummy on the cot with cards so soft they folded like cloth. She won more than she should have. I let her. The kettle sang, the propane hissed, and for a few hours at a time I could pretend the pilot had only been drunk. Then I noticed the pines. The wind through them only moved when we spoke. I tested it. Quiet, then a sentence, then quiet again, and the branches obeyed me like a held breath released. When we laughed, the whole ridge sighed with us. When we fell silent, the needles hung dead in air that should have been alive. Something out there was covering its own sound, and using ours to do it. At night, the circling began. A soft, deliberate pressure walking the base of the tower, gravel turning under a weight I did not want to measure. I counted the passes. Always 10. Never 9, never 11. On the 10th, it stopped directly beneath the ladder, waited the length of a slow inhalation, and left toward the bog. Alina laughed when I told her. She said solitude did strange arithmetic. I smiled and agreed, and stopped writing the times down because I no longer trusted paper up here. I kept them in his head instead, where nothing else could read them. The second week arrived without weather, only a stalled grey light that made the hours indistinguishable, and it was in that flat stillness that the thing beneath us began to practice. I coughed once into my sleeve at the railing, and a half-second later the same cough came back from the tree line, drier, thinner, but mine. I laughed at the strangeness of it, and my laugh returned too, arriving late enough to be wrong. Then, worst of all, I heard the small throat clearing I always did before keying the radio, that little private tick no one had ever remarked on, offered back to me from somewhere past the second stand of pines. Alina came up the ladder with her hair still wet and told me, in the same careful voice one uses near a sleeping animal, that her humming had been following her at the rain barrel. Not echo, delay, correction. It was learning the tune. We agreed, calmly, the way sensible people agree to ration water, that we would stop making unnecessary sounds. No whistling, no idle songs, no laughter we did not need. That night I woke to a cold that was only inside the cabin. Alina was sitting upright on her cot, facing the north window, and she was whispering numbers I did not recognize, long strings of them, in the exact cadence she used when counting cards. Her voice was hers, every inflection, every soft consonant. Only her eyes, catching the pale window, were not participating. By morning the circling had thinned to almost nothing, and I understood, standing at the railing with a cold cup in my hand, that it had stopped pacing because it no longer needed the exercise. It had her. It was choosing her, the way a careful shopper chooses fruit, and every quiet hour was another piece pocketed. I watched her at the little propane stove and counted the small wrongnesses. When I said her name, she took a breath first, a considering breath, before turning, as if translating the sound. She asked me, over coffee, to tell her again how we met, and she listened with her chin tipped, patient, attentive, the posture of someone taking notes on a language she meant to speak later. She did not smile at the part she always smiled at. She only nodded, once, in the wrong place. I went to the emergency radio and pressed the key, and gave our coordinates in the flat voice the manual required. What came back after the hiss was my own voice, unmistakably mine, reading the numbers again in a tone I had never used in my life. Warm, low, pleased, the way a man might speak from a doorway at the top of a staircase, holding the door open for a guest he'd been expecting all evening. Come up, that voice seemed to add beneath the words, though it added nothing. I set the handset down very gently, so that whatever was listening would not learn the sound of my hand shaking. I woke because her breath had matched the footsteps, in, on the pad of a heel, out, on the lift of a knee, slow and even and shared, the way lovers breathe in sleep, except the other body was outside and taller than the roofline had any right to allow. Through the north window I saw ribs pass, or the underside of what curved like ribs, pale and long and moving with the unhurried patience of a man walking the length of a porch he owns. It did not try the door, it did not need to. The lock was inside the cabin, and the lock was Alina, and the lock had been turning for days without either of us hearing the tumblers fall. I did not pack. I put my boots on in the dark, and I took the maintenance ladder on the south wall because the stairs creak in 3 places I had never bothered to fix. Halfway down, the voice above me was mine, and then it was hers, warm and reasonable, asking me to come back and finish the shift. Then hers again, softer, saying she forgave me for leaving. She had no reason yet to forgive me. I had not told her I was going. My hand on the next rung felt like someone else's hand. Above, the cabin door opened without a sound, which is how I learned that it had, in fact, been unlocked for hours. I walked the service trail through the muskeg in a straight line for 11 hours, because I knew if I turned to look back, the tower would not be where I had left it. The sun did not so much rise as leak, grey through grey, and the black spruce leaned in the way tired mourners lean at a graveside. I counted my steps out loud in a language I learned as a child and had not spoken since my grandmother stopped speaking it to me. 1, 2, 3, 4 in the old syllables, rough at the back of my throat, ugly and mine. It was a rhythm the thing had not yet copied, and I clung to it the way a drowning man clings to a name. Twice behind me I heard Alina calling, not the frayed voice of the last week, but the bright one from the morning we arrived, before the mountain had gotten its fingers into her, before she started matching her breath to something outside. She used the exact inflection she had used unpacking the coffee tin. I did not answer. I did not turn. I counted louder in the wrong language and kept walking. At the fire road, a maintenance truck idled, and 3 men stared at me as though I had stepped out of a lake. The lookout, they said, had been unmanned for 6 days. Their logs were clear. The last radio contact was my voice, alone, reading coordinates. The city, when I came back to it, was supposed to be loud enough to drown her out. It was not. I rented a place on the 4th floor with every window facing south, and I paid extra for that. And the landlord asked no questions when I walked the rooms with a compass in my palm. I sleep with the bed pushed against the north wall so that nothing can stand between me and it. I keep the bathroom fan on a timer. I have learned which elevators in my building hum at the frequency where she lives, and I take the stairs on those days, and I count under my breath in my grandmother's language, rough at the back of my throat, ugly and mine. She finds me anyway. In the pause between the 3rd floor and the 4th, in the exhale of the coffee machine at work, in the small silence after a door closes, she says my name in the bright unspoiled voice from the morning we arrived, before the mountain got its fingers into her. I know she's not out there. I know what wears her voice is the mountain souvenir of the woman I did not carry down the ladder. I have accepted this. So when someone calls for me, at a desk on a street in a room, I wait. I count to 3. I listen for the shape of the vowels. Only then do I turn. That is the price. I pay it every time. 40 minutes. He counted every one of them, lips moving in the dark, breath coming out in small white bursts that vanished before they reached his shoulders. The tree line sat where it had always sat, a black, ragged hem at the edge of the world, close enough that he could make out individual spruce trees, the gaps between them like missing teeth. It had looked exactly that close when he stepped off the bank. It looked exactly that close now. He stopped walking. The compass needle trembled in his palm, swinging north the way it always did, reliable as a heartbeat, and that was almost worse somehow, that one thing still behaving the way it should. He tilted it toward the pre-dawn sky, where the light was the deep, featureless blue of something not quite ready to be day, and watched the needle settle. North was north. The far bank was north. He had been walking north. He had been walking north for 40 minutes. He made himself look down slowly, the way you make yourself look at a wound, bracing for what you already know. The ice beneath his boots was smooth, not wind-scoured smooth, not snow-dusted smooth. Smooth like the surface of a mirror, smooth like nothing had ever crossed it, not a boot, not a blade, not a single living thing. He stood very still and listened to the lake. It said nothing back to him. He knew this lake. He had fished it every January for 11 years. It was not a large lake. He turned back the way he had come and walked. 4 minutes. That was all it took. 4 minutes at a steady pace, and the auger handle rose up out of the dark ahead of him like a crooked finger. The tackle bucket a squat silhouette beside the hole. The hole itself had already begun to skin over with new ice, a thin translucent membrane no thicker than an eyelid. 4 minutes south to reach what 40 minutes north had failed to leave behind. He stood over it for a moment, breathing. Then he turned again toward the far bank, toward the spruce trees with their gap-toothed silence, and he walked. He counted to 100 and stopped. Behind him, the tackle bucket was a small dark period at the end of a sentence he could not read. Ahead of him, the tree line held its position, with the patience of something that knew it did not need to move. The same dark band, the same ragged hem, the same individual trees he had been picking out for the last hour, the leaning one, the one with the broken crown, the gap that looked wider than the rest. None of it closer, not by a step. He had fished this lake for 11 years. He could throw a stone across it in summer if the wind was right. The math was not complicated, and it did not work, and his mind, searching for an explanation the way a tongue searches for a missing tooth, found only one word. He did not say it out loud. He had enough sense left for that, but it moved through him the way cold moves through a wet glove, quietly, and then all at once. There was a man at the Esso station in Dryden, 3 winters back, maybe 4, a Anishinaabe, a trapper with a face like cured leather and eyes that had seen enough of the bush to stop finding it romantic. They had stood by the coffee machine making the kind of small talk men make when the thermometer is doing something serious outside. The trapper had said it almost as an aside, almost smiling, the way a person smiles when they are telling you something true that they know you will not believe. He had said the old stories never described the Wendigo the way the movies did, with the claws and the height of it, the teeth. He said the real sign, the old sign, was the land itself going wrong, that distances stopped obeying, that the ground began working for it instead of for you, the way a current works for a drowning man's lungs. He had laughed at that. He remembered the sound of his own laugh in the fluorescent light of that gas station, easy and dismissive, the laugh of a man who had never needed to believe in anything the dark produced. He turned northeast now, angling toward the creek mouth where his truck sat with half a tank of gas and a thermos on the seat. He walked for 20 minutes at a pace he could sustain. The inlet did not come. The shore did not come. Beneath his boots, the ice ticked once and then again, small private sounds, the lake talking to itself. And from the tree line he could not reach, he could hear the spruce boughs breathing in the wind, close enough that he should have been standing among them. He was not standing among them. He sat down on the tackle bucket and unwrapped the last of the granola bar, the foil loud and indecent in the stillness. He ate it in 4 bites and made himself think. Methodically, the way his father had taught him to think in a crisis, one true thing and then the next. He had a headlamp. He had a hand warmer in his breast pocket, good for another 2 hours if he did not squeeze it anxious and burn through it faster. He had a hatchet on his belt, the small one, the kind made for splitting kindling rather than fighting anything. He had no signal, which was normal, which was not the problem. He became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound that has been present for some time before you named it. The ice was not flat. It was subtle enough that his eyes kept refusing it, kept smoothing it back into level the way the mind refuses certain shapes. But it was there, a curvature so gradual it seemed almost polite about what it implied, the surface rising toward every horizon in the same patient degree, the way the interior of an enormous bowl would rise. He lowered himself until his cheek was nearly touching the ice, sighting along the surface the way a carpenter checks a board for truth. The curve held. It did not waver or resolve into an illusion. Frozen water finds level. It has no reason to do anything else. It has no preference, no intent, no architecture. A lake does not curve inward. A lake does not hold its shape around anything. He ran. It was not a decision so much as a collapse of patience, the body finally overruling the mind's careful inventory of true things. He drove his boots hard into the ice and ran toward the tree line with everything he had, arms pumping, breath tearing out of him in white rags, the cold searing down his throat with every desperate pull of air. He ran the way he had not run since he was a boy, being chased by something he believed in completely. The spruce trees did not grow closer. He watched them as he ran, and they held their distance with a patience that was nearly courteous, swaying slightly in a wind he could not feel on his face, keeping their interval the way an escort keeps pace, and he ran harder, thighs burning, vision beginning to fur at the edges, until his legs gave their final opinion on the matter, and he pitched forward, caught himself on both hands, and crouched on the ice with his lungs screaming in the cold. When he straightened and turned back, his hold was gone. He stood very still and looked. The ice behind him was seamless in every direction, smooth and grey, white and unmarked, as though nothing had ever sat on it or drilled through it or bled warmth into it. His bucket was gone. His auger was gone. The small depression of kicked snow and shaved ice he had made over 2 hours of work simply was not there. The sky had gone the pale, featureless grey of mid-morning. He had arrived before first light, and it was getting colder. He was calm now. That was the thing that frightened him most, in the small distant way that fear still functioned, the way a fire functions through 6 inches of ice. The calm was not peace. It was what remained after panic had finished its excavation and moved on, leaving the chambers swept clean and cold and very quiet. He walked in a straight line and drove the hatchet into the ice every 30 paces. He counted aloud, which seemed important, the numbers leaving his mouth in small white clouds that the air absorbed immediately. At 10 marks he stopped and turned back to verify his work. 9 marks. He stood and breathed and counted again. 9. He walked back toward the start, watching the ice behind him as he went, and counted again at what should have been the beginning. 8. He did not run. He turned forward and drove the hatchet in and turned back immediately, within the same breath, and counted. 7. They were not disappearing. That was the specific horror of it. There was no moment of vanishing, no drama, no seam where presence became absence. They were simply being unmade at roughly the rate he made them ahead, a quiet arithmetic, a patient subtraction. He thought about the word hunger again. He thought about what hunger does to the body that holds it, how it turns a thing mostly inward, how a starving creature becomes more cavity than creature, more want than flesh. He thought about what it would mean for a lake to want. He saw it first as a shape that did not belong to the trees, too vertical, too still, too deliberate in its stillness. It stood at the boundary where the ice surrendered to shore, inside the shadow of the spruces but not hidden by them, as though it wanted to be seen and had arranged itself accordingly. He raised his arm. A slow, testing gesture, the kind you make when you're not certain you're looking at a person, and more certain you do not want to be wrong either way. It did not raise its arm. He shouted. He felt the effort of it in his chest and throat, felt the cold air dragged in to fuel the sound, felt the shape his mouth made around the words. But the shout left him and simply stopped, the way a stone stops when it meets deep water. No echo, no carry, no evidence it had ever existed. The ice swallowed it. The air swallowed it. Something between him and the tree line swallowed it. He took a step toward shore, then another. The figure did not move, did not shift its weight, did not tilt its head at the sound that had failed to reach it. By the 3rd step he understood that the distance was not shrinking. It was not that the shore was far. It was that the space between them was thick with something he could not see, something that had no temperature because it was the thing temperature fled from, and he was standing inside it, and he had been standing inside it for a very long time. He stopped walking. It was not a decision so much as a recognition, the way you recognize a word you have been mispronouncing your whole life, a small correction that rearranges everything behind it. He lowered himself to the ice slowly, the way a man lowers himself into cold water, and he sat with his legs folded beneath him at the exact center of a lake that no longer had a center, or rather had nothing but center in every direction, center without circumference, center the way a throat is a center. The figure at the tree line went still the moment he stopped moving. Not stiller, still. The distinction felt important. It had never been moving. He understood now that what he had been reading as presence was actually cessation, the shape of something finished. He pressed his palm flat to the ice. It was warm, not the warmth of a surface that had held sunlight, the warmth of something working, the warmth of digestion. It held his hand the way he had always understood deep water held things, completely, from every direction at once, with a patience that had no opposite. He tried to think the word out and could not find the end of it. The ice was not beneath him. He was inside it, had been inside it since before his first step, since before he had noticed the quiet, since before the fish house, since before some threshold he had crossed without any sensation of crossing, without a sound, without a seam. The lake had more room in it than the world outside had room for a lake. He was nowhere near the bottom.